my name is Rob Gordon. I'm a clinical psychologist. I've been working with occupational stress, amongst other things, for most of my career. And I've been asked to make a few comments about stress and beekeeping. It's a great pleasure to speak to beekeepers because I love to watch them in my little orchard pollinating my trees. So anything I can do to help those fellows and you who look after them, it's a great pleasure. I guess I start with the issue of stress at work with why do we work? I don't mean in terms of money and income and so on, but what's the meaning of the work we do? And I guess beekeeping, amongst other things, will be something full of meaning for the people who do it. Very ancient craft. And that meaning is something to be protected and taken care of, because what I notice is that we are prepared to make very substantial sacrifices and to exert a great deal of effort for something that is meaningful in terms of what are important values to us, the environment, the community, whatever it might be. Therefore, anything that tends to get in the way of those values that give meaning to our work break an important loop. I put out a lot of energy, work really hard, long hours, a lot of emotional commitment. And then the loop is I get back that sense of satisfaction. Yes, look what I've been able to achieve. Look at how I've been able to give expression to the important values that are very much a central part of who I am. So let's imagine that loop's in place and people work hard and thoroughly enjoy their work. And people watch them and say, gee, they work really hard. I don't know how they do it. They do it because they love it. I think most people love their work. At least that's a healthy way to be. And what happens then when you get a long, hard period of difficult work? Without the satisfaction, I guess for you guys, the production of honey in the end is a really important part of the satisfaction. You actually produce the goods, that you have thriving hives. And I imagine you attach yourselves to the hives in some way, have an emotional attachment, take care of the little critters, care about them. And so as long as that's going, you've got this loop that replenishes the energy. When the stress builds and life becomes hard and the bees die and there's not enough nectar and so on and so forth, and you just have a lot of work for not a great deal of reward, the first thing that happens is we move from a state of where we do this work because we love it to, oh, we're doing it because we have to do it. We still love it if we stop and think about it, but we don't really have much time to stop and think. And the loss of time to reflect is a really important part of the stress response. Because, you know, it's a very important thing that we can digest our experiences as we go along. Like, I don't know if you've ever gobbled down your dinner and gone out and done something and it just sits there, doesn't digest. Then you go to bed and you can't sleep because your dinner's just sitting there. We don't need a great deal of leisure, but we need some leisure to digest our meals. We can't go out and immediately do things. We've got to have a bit of downtime. Get your sandwich down at lunchtime and just have even 10 minutes just to sit and look at the sun and then let it go down. So when we don't digest our experience, it becomes indigestible too. And just as with our digestion, we have a feeling it just sits there, it doesn't move on. In fact, if we've had too much garlic, it'll keep coming back, won't it? We'll have burps and You can smell the onions and so on. It hasn't gone on down and had all the right things happen to it so that there's no trace of the onion smell. We just get nourished by the food. And in the work situation, the lack of digestion of the work experience means bits of it keep coming up. We keep thinking about it, keep worrying about it, keep talking about it, keep remembering things that are emotionally significant without us being able to do anything about them. And then they bring the sadness, maybe, if we've lost hives. That regurgitation, in a sense, is a sure sign that there hasn't been enough digestion. How do we digest? Well, interesting thing is we digest really without thinking about it in our bodies, don't we? We don't have to do anything. We just have to just take pressure off and sit around for a while, and it all happens. In our mind, with our experience, I think we digest things in our relationships and in our community by just talking about things, comparing notes, contrasting your experience with somebody else's, learning things, telling your anecdotes, telling your stories are a really important part of digesting. Getting experiences that you've taken in and responded to converted into words and a story that actually puts it out. We know that in the brain there are different parts. There's an input part at the back and an output part at the front. And we know that taking things in means that they'll just tend to sit there with all the same feelings and intensity and so on they had when we took them in. By actually wanting to explain it to somebody, I've got to bring it into a different part of my brain. I've got to use language. I've got to use communication skills, tell the story. That changes it completely. And that's like adding all the enzymes and digestive juices to it all. Instead of having one big lump, we have to string it out into a story, a sequence, a narrative. And, you know, we spend a lot of our time doing that without thinking about it. You know, over a cup of tea, talking to your workmates, you just talk about things. After dinner, you might talk to your partner about the day's activities. You might do it on the phone with somebody. And if things work well, you're doing it without thinking about it. Therefore, isolation is one of the serious problems with stress. It increases our stress, doesn't exactly cause it, but if we're under stress, it increases it. And when we're stressed, we often find, particularly if people don't understand us so well, we'll tend to withdraw, and so you get into a spiral. So one of the first things I would say in stress is be aware that supporting your social relationships is supporting your ability to digest these stress responses. Another thing I'd point out is that when we get stressed, we go into a state where we become specialised for dealing with the stress. A number of reactions take place. We tend to narrow our perspective onto the stressor so we don't see things in context, so we can easily get things out of whack. We overvalue the importance of one thing and ignore the context. That might make errors of judgment, mightn't it? Because judgment's about making a decision about something within the context of the whole situation. Stress always loses that whole. Another thing that happens with stress is we tend to deal with the most immediate superficial problem that we can easily deal with rather than sit back and think of the whole situation and the longer term implications. So therefore, when you're stressed, you have trouble thinking strategically, laterally, creatively, in problem solving way, planning, and all of those creative skills that we need when we have to solve complex problems. The stress might show up physically as increased muscular tension, a whole range of what we call psychosomatic complaints, you know, skin problems, digestive difficulties, headaches, a whole range of different problems, which we know we've got a tendency towards anyway, but always flare up when we're more stressed. It's because the stress response drags energy out of the body and puts it into where we need it to be, probably in our mind and our muscles. And so all of the other systems of the body deteriorate. And you know, we can go for a while and our bodies will absorb it. but eventually they'll start to show some signs of it. You know, your hair changes, doesn't it? It goes grey and falls out in men, and with women it becomes brittle and splits and cracks, and our fingernails get grooves and ridges in them and so on. All sorts of indicators that the body is being depleted of energy. And so we have the difficulty thinking clearly, we have the deterioration in our body, we have a sort of intolerance for more complex emotions. And we tend to revert to the hardwired inbuilt emotions, which are really often tactless. We get irritable, impatient, angry. They're not all negative. We do feel happy, but we suddenly fall off our perch and get upset about things. We get a bit depressed rather than just being a little bit down. Things tend to be exaggerated. And the final thing is that we tend to reduce our energy, because that's what stress is all about, is conserving energy and focusing it on the one thing that we've got to do to reduce the stress. So we pull energy out of our social relationships. We tend to let etiquette go, good manners, you know, like our grandmas taught us. We don't say please and thank you. We bark at people. We tell them what we need them to do rather than ask them if they wouldn't mind helping us out with something. It takes too bloody long, doesn't it, to be nice to people. We just want them to get on and do what they're supposed to do. And so you get this lack of care and attention to the other person, because actually, in the end, when we're stressed, we're all self-centered, because stress is a mechanism to help me survive my problem. Now, I haven't got enough energy to worry about your problem, so I need you to do this to survive my problem. Well, that's all right, unless the other person says, well, I need you to do this to survive my problem, and you hit head on, and you get people having a bit of a barney about nothing much in particular, because they're both having a bad day. So I think to be aware that these are all stress signs. Now, there's a few things we can do. First of all, you can try and identify the stresses. Might be money, you might be grieving for the loss of hives. I understand in the bushfires, many people lost many hives, and I'm sure you knew them all. And I'm sure they all have some kind of emotional impact. And I think it's important to acknowledge grief for the forest as well as the bees and the environment. It will come back, but it'll take a long time. And grief is the response to loss. Grief involves sadness, reminiscing, feelings. And therefore, I think it's important to know that when you're grieving, you need a bit of support and a bit of comfort to help us tolerate the sadness. If we don't acknowledge the sadness, it'll tend to flip into irritability and anger. So this the grief side of it, and then there's the feeling of what do we actually need to bring us out the other side? Well, I think the first thing we need to do is build our energy. Without energy, we can't find a way through. And stress absorbs an enormous amount of energy. So watch for sleep. Make sure you pay attention to your sleep and give time and attention to getting good sleeps. It's the best source of energy. The other thing, of course, diet and all those things that you read about in any stress management advice are really important, because we tend to go for stimulants because we feel low and so on. These are bad in the long run. But the important thing I want to emphasize here is that stress depletes us of a source of energy that we don't normally use, because it takes energy out of our bodies. And we'll often get a sense of fatigue that is not really relieved by resting, having a bit of a day off and so on. We still feel very tired. So it's not just rest that cures this sort of fatigue from stress. It's enjoyment. Because when you're stressed, you're probably not having fun. You're just doing what you have to do because you've got these really deep drivers. There's things I talked about at the very beginning that give you meaning. Livelihood's a big one, of course. But these drivers tend to override the the question of, am I enjoying myself? So I say that the means to restore the energy from stress is two things: pleasure and leisure. We haven't got time for that sort of nonsense. Don't you realise we've got a lot of problems, you'll say to me? And I'll say, yeah. Well, let me tell you about the guy who owned a caravan park in a Black Saturday community that was really badly damaged. And he was very stressed towards the end of the first year, but he couldn't get anything done. His stress meant he just couldn't get his head around what he needed to do, and he wasted time and he did things twice over and he couldn't plan and so on. And then he heard one of my talks and he realised that he was stressed. Next time I went up to that community, gave a talk, maybe 6 months later, he said, came up to me afterwards, I'd never met him before, and he said, when you gave me your first talk, up here, I realised what the problem was. So I immediately made a plan to take my family to Bali for a couple of weeks. When I got back, I was able to achieve more in 3 days than I'd achieved in 3 weeks before I left. Now, this is a really important point, that we become so inefficient. We work hard for less output when we're stressed. It's all right for doing very simple routine stuff that we've got to grind our way through for a certain period of time when we've got a big project on. But when you're in a process of recovering from a serious loss to your business and burned hives and bushfires and all the other kind of problems that can occur, you've got to be clever, you've got to be lateral, you've got to be creative. Can't do that in the stress mode. So therefore, I'd say you can't afford not to take pleasure and leisure. What's pleasure? Pleasure is anything that gives me joy. Right? What gives you joy? Make sure you've got some source of joy that you keep running alongside in your life or alongside your work. You don't have to do it all the time, but you have to be able to look forward. Yeah, on Saturday I'm going to do this, or on Sunday or Thursday night or whatever. I'll see those people. I'll do that thing. You know, a project that's running along, making a piece of furniture or knitting something, or reading a book, or painting a picture, or doing a bit of jogging and improving your times. Doesn't matter. Something that's got an ongoing. And leisure is, by definition, leisure is when I don't have to do anything. I haven't got time for that nonsense. Yes, it's a matter of quality, not quantity. I haven't got much time. Okay, Sunday afternoon from 4 to 5 o'clock, I'm going to take leisure. That means I don't have to do anything, so I can sit in the sun and wonder what I should do next. And it's that time that actually gives you the perspective. We don't get perspective when we're involved. We get perspective when we sit back and have time to think. You can think, just don't do anything. And then we tune into ourselves. That takes away from that fundamental process of stress of throwing us out of ourselves into the world. And when we actually get in touch with ourselves, we start to know what we need. We start to feel, we feel tired in the right way. And say, gee, that was good. I'll try and take an hour and a half next week. Well, maybe I'll do a bit on Wednesday night as well. Or in the end, you start to realize I'm really enjoying it. I might take half an hour every night or more. And then you start to build a routine. And this way, you start to replenish. And I'll come back to my first point. A very important sign that people have been under too much stress for too long is that someday you just wake up and say, what am I doing this for again? I can't remember. Or you're out in the middle and you say, well, who cares? I'm over it. This is a really important sign because it means the stress has gone so far that it's beginning to undermine that feedback loop that keeps the energy going. Because when we're very stressed, we start to lose touch with those deeper drivers of the purpose, meaning, reason of why we do what we do, because that's ultimately going to come from who we are. And none of us can avoid that if we work too hard for too long without any leisure or any time to stop and reflect and get in touch with the bigger picture of things. So these are things we can't afford not to do. There are a whole range of other ways of dealing with stress, and I'm sure if you Google stress management, techniques, etc. You'll come up with all sorts of things that are very helpful in particular areas of your life about minimising stress. But I think I'd like to share with you this sort of what I've learned about the big picture of understanding stress in our lives. I hope those observations are helpful.